subtitle is How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. And we wrote this book, came out in January of 2018. We decided to write this book right after the election in 2016, November 2016. I actually wanted to, I was thinking about it after the Brexit referendum in Britain in June 2016. So I think we're living, as I will talk about, through a very interesting period where the way in which we solve problems in the world is about to fundamentally change. Everything has changed, right? I mean, we feel it every day. Demographic transformation, economic restructuring, the pace of technological innovation, climate change. I mean, you can't go through a day without feeling we're living in this incredible period of anxiety. And there are serious social divisions that have occurred in this country around income and wealth and health. And it's not surprising when you have a period like this that you have a radical restructuring of national politics. We've been through this before, and this is not a partisan comment. I mean, it's just the reality of what happens during these kinds of periods. So you have Brexit in the United Kingdom. That hasn't gone very well. Has anyone watched the recent House of Commons debate with Boris Johnson? If you haven't and you want to laugh, watch that. And we've had the election of Trump. But there's something else going on beneath that. And it's really about the elevation of the city-state and actually the decline and diminishment of the nation-state. So even though we consume national news every day, and you think that the center of the universe is Washington, D.C., actually, the way in which most things happen in the United States, or in most parts of the country, tend to be led by cities. So why cities, right? Well, because cities are the center of innovation and productivity, and actually, if you look at the most academic studies, the more density you have, what we now call innovation districts, around advanced research universities, mature companies, et cetera, the more company formation and company expansion you're going to get. Economic opportunity, not just for the doctoral students who might be coming out of engineering at a great university, but frankly, for a large portion of our population to get the right credentials, this kind of economy can lead to enormous economic opportunity. The cities are at the vanguard of diversity, right? They will become majority, minority before the country. Many already have. And they're really at the cusp of a different kind of sustainable development, given environmental pressures and climate. So what we basically said in localism is power and responsibility is shifting downward in the world from the nation state, right? That's how we generally thought about solving problems in the 21st century. Top down, national government, specialized agencies, right? If you have a transportation problem, go to the Department of Transportation. If you have a housing problem, go to HUD. It's more bottom-up now. It's more multi-sector, public, private, civic, university, labor. And it's definitely interdisciplinary. If you have a traffic problem, there may be a technological solution. It may be about density of employment and residential. So we call that the new localism. And we think that is essentially a governing philosophy for the 21st century because we're living in a networked world, and cities are not governments. Cities are networks, right? Federal government is a government, and the state government is a government, and therefore they can be hijacked by partisanship and riven by ideological division, and most of the time they are. Cities are networks, right? I mean, the mayor's here, and city council's here, but you also have business leaders and philanthropies and universities and hospitals, and the list goes on and on. And when you have a network, you tend to be more pragmatic. You tend to be solving problems. So we got a lot of hard problems, right? Washington talks about the problems. Your state goes in and out of talking and doing. This is the place that actually is where the rubber hits the road. So what Jeremy and I did was went out in the United States, North America, Europe, and looked for models. Because when you're in a city world, an urban a network world, that's a city world. So we went looking for models of growth that were inclusive and sustainable and innovative, governance structures that were really networked, interdisciplinary, and financial tools. A lot of our focus is not just what to do, but how to finance it, right? So where do we end up with? Pittsburgh is our growth model, right? How many people have been to Pittsburgh? Okay, so you'll get the Pittsburgh story. This was Pittsburgh in 1973. My father's sister married a guy from Steubenville, Ohio. So he was part of the steel supply chain. So when I was 7 years old, they would take me to JFK Airport, put me on a plane, and send me to Steubenville, Ohio. I thought this was the greatest place in the world, except I couldn't breathe because of the air. But they had Bob's Big Boy. I mean, we didn't have, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. We didn't have anything that you would watch on television. I would have to go to Steubenville to find it. But this is what Pittsburgh looked like in the 70s, right? Arsenal of democracy. All that collapsed in the late 70s. Overnight, tens of thousands of jobs disappeared with the steel industry collapse. And what our book says is the revival of Pittsburgh started here, in 3 Mile Island, right? Because 3 Mile Island, the nuclear disaster, the China syndrome, was owned essentially by Westinghouse. And when this nuclear disaster occurred, what Westinghouse began to think about was how much is it going to cost us, A, to figure out what happened, and B, to figure out how to solve it. They came up with these plans that were in the hundreds and hundreds of millions. They ultimately found this guy sitting on top of some contraption. His name is Red Whitaker. He's still alive. He's one of the first roboticists in the United States, when no one even knew what that meant. It was like a sci-fi kind of thing. And they went to him at Carnegie Mellon and said, could you figure out what the nature of the full cost of the 3 Mile Island disaster is? And he says, yeah, I'm actually experimenting with these little cars that I can control. This is the beginning of autonomous vehicles. And I'll send them into the bowels of 3 Mile Island, and it'll cost $1 million, and then I'll tell you how to clean this thing up. So that's the beginning of Robot Row in Pittsburgh, right? So this is the innovation district, and this is why cities are so critical. You have Carnegie Mellon, right, which is the epicenter of advanced engineering, computer science, not just in Pittsburgh, but around the world. You fall out of bed, you're in the University of Pittsburgh, right, which is now one of the top 5 biotech places in the world. And then you've got University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and all these other incubators, accelerators, seed funding, angel funding, and it's a whole ecosystem, all within a magic square mile in the Oakland district of Pittsburgh. And when we think about which cities are going to basically be able to thrive, part of this is about technology. There's about 12 technologies in the world that are going to sweep through and are going to be about half of global GDP in the next 15 years. And Pittsburgh's in 5 of them. I mean, they're literally in 5 of them. And that's why Pittsburgh is reviving. And the way in which they revive is you had a series of philanthropies and corporations that, starting with the steel collapse, started to invest in centers of advanced research. We were by the Nano Center before. You've got this amazing engineering school coming up at AT. I mean, this stuff really matters. Investing in centers of excellence at your advanced universities. As he then goes to the next slide. So Pittsburgh's the it city, right? I mean, you go there, a lot of millennials want to be there. Restaurants, amenities, it's all live, work, play, and you have a lot of that already here. But what Pittsburgh also has is this. These are basically Silicon Valley or other highly advanced technology companies that are going to Pittsburgh not because they're throwing tax abatements at them. They're going there because they have to be next to the secret sauce, right? Really smart people inventing and figuring out how to deploy really advanced technology. So Amazon had its bake-off. You know, everyone ran around trying to get Amazon to come. Pittsburgh already has an R&D unit from Amazon. It's better to get the R&D to get everyone just sweeping through your city. But these folks have to be there. They have to be there because of artificial intelligence and big data city has to think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. Matthew Taylor runs the Royal Society of Arts in England, and think like a system. So you have to think about the connections between things, not just transportation, not just housing, not just workforce, not just economic development, not just capital, but the connections across. And then you have to act like an entrepreneur. You have to take risks, right? Pittsburgh took risks in the late 70s and early 80s because they said, we can't look back. Steel is gone, right? It's not coming back. So what are we going to be in the next 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years? This place, like other parts of the country, has been hit hard by economic restructuring. I mean, I saw it today as we went around the various mills and other parts of the city. And those are getting repurposed in really imaginative ways. So a couple lessons from the great state of Pittsburgh. First of all, you want to move from being a rust belt to being a brain belt. It's as simple as that. It's hard to do, but it's simple to try to think through what the transition has to look like. You want to build on your past strengths. Partly, you want to build on your past older facilities, your buildings. I mean, that's what people want. I mean, when I'm in Europe and they're saying, you know, where do Americans go? The startup community, the tech community. Go find an old warehouse, right? Go find a place that was at the periphery of your downtown that wasn't torn down in the 50s or 60s when we did urban renewal, because everyone said, let's not even waste our time tearing that down. That's where people want to be today. It's phenomenal. And philanthropy. Philanthropy is critical because it has the patience to invest and not expect a market return. It's a long-term kind of focus, and the notion of long-term will come back and back as we go through this. So that's Pittsburgh. That's the growth model. Indianapolis. How many people have been to Indianapolis? Well, good amount. Actually, more than usual. So here's Indianapolis in the 70s. Bill Hunnut, great mayor. This is what men, I guess, did in Indianapolis on a weekend. You go down with a shotgun and you go shoot pigeons. Kurt Vonnegut, great American novelist, actually grew up in Indianapolis. And when he was asked about his native town, he basically said, it's a place where for 364 days you play miniature golf, and then the last day you go to the Speedway. So this was a really boring place, you know, and in the mid-70s they began to sit and say, what are we going to be? Because no one wants to come here. There's nothing, literally nothing to do. Because the downtown is decentralized and depopulated. So they began to think about a big plan. And their big plan was to become, you know, the amateur sports capital of the United States and the world. It was when the Olympics was becoming more professionalized. This is, of course, before we boycotted Moscow in 1980, but at the time it seemed like a good plan. So they just started building a bunch of stuff, right? Sports facilities, right in the downtown, because they were thinking if we have sports facilities, like your baseball stadium here, a lot's going to happen around it. And then they started populating all these sports stadiums with first amateur sports, and then they built this football stadium. And literally in the dead of night, they sent a whole bunch of trucks to Baltimore and stole the Baltimore Colts. And you know, so they were becoming like the John Dillinger of city. Let's just, you know, steal stuff. So they got very, very good at this stuff, by the way, and more sports stadium. And they created this thing called the Indiana Sports Corporation. And it was the beginning of a network governance model where the public sector would sit with the leaders of corporations, philanthropies, and universities, and figure out what sports to occupy. You know, they couldn't do skiing, but they pretty much covered everything else. At some point, you know, how much beer and hot dogs can you consume, right? I mean, you sort of run out. And they began to think, okay, we're going to have to, in the mid-90s, move from a sports strategy to an advanced industry strategy. Because they understood early on, if you begin to invest in R&D, and you begin to invest in workers with science and technology, and engineering, and arts, design, and math, that's the way to grow a prosperous economy. So they began to think about going from basketball to bio, essentially, right? And And they created something called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, which is only 60 CEOs. The public sector is actually not part of the government, right? It's basically the universities, the corporations, and the philanthropies. And they have the Lilly Endowment, which is no slouch in terms of philanthropy. And they created the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, and they said, okay, let's study what we're really good at. What Indianapolis is really good at, and frankly the entire state of Indiana is really good at, is bio, life sciences. Partly drugs, because of Lilly, right? Pharmaceuticals, but also medical devices. And if you actually look today and say, which state is the second biggest exporter of life science products, not surprisingly, number one is California. Number two is Indiana. Number two is Indiana. And partly it's because this group of CEOs across multiple sectors began to invest in a whole range of initiatives to bulk up their research grants, to bulk up the training of workers to go into their companies, right? To actually steal faculty from around the world. I mean, they had stolen sports teams, so they just went out and started stealing faculty, right? And then ultimately to build one of the biggest bioscience research centers in the world. So an enormous amount of capital from the private and philanthropic sector went to basically start companies, expand companies, and then build an Indiana Biosciences Research Institute. Now, in the past, we used to just do this with congressional earmarks, right? You go to your senator, you go to your congressman, okay, we want to build this center or that center. Well, that's over. You got to do it from internal, right? And they did it, and they did it very early. So when you think about what the lesson is, it's about being an ecosystem rather than an ecosystem. You walk into that room, Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, you have the head of Lilly, you have the head of Roche, you have the Lilly Endowment, which is about $13 billion in assets. These people run big institutions, right? They're used to everyone basically scrambling to serve their every need. When they walk in that room, they are just part of the company board of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, right? And their goal there is the rules in the sandbox, play well together, right? And do something for the larger good. So some other lessons from this incredible story. What's this thing? Oh, here we go. First of all, too fast. The mechanics of collaboration. Think about this. When they meet to decide, not to discuss. Think about that. 60 CEOs, and they've basically delegated to this professional staff, which is relatively small. When we walked in a room, we're making investments, or we're deciding on the next initiative, right? And we trust you, and we'll interact with you during the interim period, so that we can actually move forward. Very interesting. Multiple geographic levels. They start at the district level, usually an innovation hub around the universities. Then they go to the downtown. Then they go to the city. Then they go to the metro. And Indianapolis is a combined city-county. And then they actually reach across all of Indiana. And anyone, company, university, philanthropy that has a pulse in life sciences, they drag in. So I was at Notre Dame with Mayor Pete, this is before he ran, and they were proudly telling me how they were part of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. I said, well, how could that be? We're in Northwest Indiana. I said, we're very good at big data analytics, and the next play is genomics and biotech, right? That's why we're involved. Very smart. And the last piece is they're organizing private and civic wealth. The U.S. does not lack for capital. We just haven't organized it, right? There's an enormous amount of wealth in this country, right? But how can a city or a metropolis organize that wealth for private good, but also public benefit? That's what they figured out in Indianapolis. So last piece is Copenhagen. How many people have been to Copenhagen? So these are the bikers in the room. Okay? That's, people when they go to Copenhagen, what you have to do is just bike. I mean, the most dangerous thing in Copenhagen is to step out of your hotel and not look for cars, look for bikes. Those people are really, they're Vikings, basically. manufacturing had essentially died in the city. And they had sprawled like most American metropolitan areas. The population had left the core and moved out to the suburbs. And so a group of political leaders from different parties, the mayor and the leaders of the parliamentary parties, sat down and said, we need to do something really big. And the only issue is we have to do it without spending a kroner. We can't tax the public for anything we do because they've had it and we're about to be bankrupt anyway. So they came up with this idea of creating a 21st century metro system, a subway system essentially, without spending any tax money. Okay, so how did they figure this one out? First of all, they created a company that owned all the public land, initially between the downtown and the airport. And this was land owned by the military. I didn't really know Denmark had a military, but that's what they did. It was all, that's where they did shooting practice, essentially. And then they took the whole harbor, massive harbor, which is basically the camp for Sweden. And they took all the land around the harbor. And the national government and the city government agreed to create one corporation that they would mutually own, 55% local, 45% national. It took them a little while to sue each other in the courts before they could figure that one out, but in any event, they figured it out. They created one corporation, the City and Port Development Corporation. And all this land, the Orested district, which is that bit between the airport and the downtown, the North Harbor, North Haven, all of it was basically put into service of financing the subway system. So they would sell, ultimately they just started leasing land, and all the revenue generated by the regeneration of the core went to service the debt on the subway system. That's how they figured this out, right? And they maximized the highest and best use of what they did in these areas. So if you go to Orested, because the Copenhagen airport is basically, after, or maybe with Amsterdam, the best airport to fly into Europe, right? And so a lot of different consultancies, universities, corporations are all located in this Orested district. And then the harbor, if you've ever been to Copenhagen, it's just an incredible place. I mean, it's become residential, mixed use, all the wonderful things we want in the world. All the wealth that's been generated by that has gone partly to the private sector, right? These are capitalists. And partly to the public. The value, a portion of the value appreciation has gone to service the debt on infrastructure. So voila, if you don't want a bike in Copenhagen, I've actually never ridden a bike in Copenhagen because I actually want to live. I can't even compete with a 3-year-old thing. I take the subway. I mean, it is incredible. Driverless subway cars, all paid for by a portion of the value of regenerating your city. As we talk about Greensboro, right, the public owns a lot in our cities in the United States. Well, we have land banks, convention center authorities, stadium authorities, port authorities, airport authorities. I want to be an authority when I grow up. I want to be the head of the parking garage authority. That's the real job. I mean, mayor, that's a better job. That's where the money is. But we have, so what they did is they unified the ownership of their public assets. We won't do that in this country. But at least we can align some of our public assets toward a broader goal. So, former mayor of Copenhagen, who was part of the deal to do this, then he became head of the City and Port Development Corporation because it's like the only one anyone trusted. We're not here for the quick fix. We're here for the long haul. Right? We're not here just to have a fire sale of public assets because we have to fill this budget gap this year. This is a 75-year plan. So we become the 3rd richest city in the world, which Copenhagen is today. Transparency. Everyone knows what the public owns. I guarantee you that no one really knows what the public owns in the United States. You have the federal government, you have states, you've got all these authorities, you've got general purpose, you got the schools, you got the fire. No one really knows what the government owns in the U.S. And therefore, we don't really have a public wealth strategy. They merge public entities. I'm not sure that has to happen, but it's helpful when it does. And they have a public-private management model. So we think about public-private partnerships as deals, right? We're American. Let's do the deal, right? They think of it as institutions. The public sector and the private sector come together and govern institutions together. And those institutions then act at the service of the broader public for the long haul. So, you know, Copenhagen is not perfect. We're a hell of a lot more innovative, we're a hell of a lot more entrepreneurial. If you want to see the next product innovation, look to the United States. I mean, that's what we do so well. But when you look at their public realm, and you look at how they organize their cities, we have a lot to learn. We took about 150 Denver business people to Copenhagen in June because they were basically thinking about where should we go on our next trip. And I was there with the Downtown Denver Partnership, and they said, should we go to Seattle? Should we go to Austin? Should we, I mean, you know, the usual kind of places in the U.S. I said, are you crazy? Get out of the U.S.? I mean, we don't know how to do this stuff. Amsterdam, right? Copenhagen, Singapore. I mean, if we want to be globally competitive, we need to be less parochial. So, how do we become a nation of problem solvers? Because the bottom line is, what I'm describing is not a cyclical event. It's not just because the national government decided to be on a frolic and detour for 20 years, and then suddenly they'll come back. Oh, where'd you go? Okay. And then suddenly they're going to come back. We're ready to lead again. Have you been to Washington lately? I was chief of staff at HUD. If you go there at 10 o'clock in the morning, I guarantee you can go up to the 10th floor, throw a baseball, you won't hit anyone. There's no one there anymore, right? I mean, so we're not going to be led from the center in the United States. That's not who we are anyway. I think history will record the bulking up of the federal government in the 50s and 60s as an aberration of history. I mean, we're a distributed, decentralized nation. We're a federal republic. So how do you create a nation of problem solvers? Because we're going to have to get our act together at this level, really at the city level and at the county level. So, you know, bottom line, we got a couple issues here. For every Pittsburgh that really does invest in long-term innovation, got dozens of cities that are just subsidizing consumption. For every Indianapolis, we do collaborate a lot across sectors in the U.S. It tends to be informal. It's not really resourced like it is in Indianapolis. That's just a model of incredibly resourced collaboration. And every Copenhagen, we don't even know what we own. And that, for that reason, we're not really leveraging public assets or church assets or nonprofit assets in a way that